Have you ever felt like you're trying every trick in the book to get better at English? You know, poring over grammar books, memorizing vocabulary lists, got the apps buzzing on your phone, even squeezing in those language podcasts. And I bet some of you feel this, it's like you're putting in all this work, but not really getting anywhere. Kind of makes you wonder if it's even worth the effort, you know? Well, today, we're going to shake things up a bit.
I like where this is going.
We're diving deep into 5 surprisingly simple habits that can give your English a real boost, all inspired by this English in Comfort video I found on YouTube. We're not talking about some crazy language hacks or overnight fluency miracles, just good old-fashioned practical steps that can make a huge difference when you make them part of your daily routine. It's like, if you can stick with these, you'll be surprised how much more comfortable and confident you'll feel speaking English.
I think that's spot on. And the thing about these habits, what really struck me, is that they're all about weaving English learning into your everyday life, not making it some separate big thing you got to carve out time for.
Makes sense. Right. I mean, think about how we learn our first language. It's not like we sat down with textbooks and grammar drills as babies.
Exactly.
So habit number 1, and they really hammer this home in the video, is reading in English every single day. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Daily reading sounds like a huge commitment, like I'm already juggling a million things, but the video actually has a really clever take on this.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
They're not saying you need to suddenly become a bookworm and devour War and Peace. Even just 30 minutes a day can make a real impact. And let's face it, most of us probably waste way more time scrolling through social media than that, right? Think about it. What if you swapped 30 minutes of Instagram or TikTok for 30 minutes of English reading?
That's a pretty simple trade-off when you put it that way.
It really is. And you don't even have to start with super challenging stuff. The video actually recommends easing into it, you know? Maybe pick up some news articles about things you're already interested in. Maybe find some short stories that grab your attention. Or even just go back and reread some of your favorite children's books in English. The point is to build a habit. Make it something you enjoy and look forward to, not something that feels like a chore.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, who wants to dread their English practice? It should be something that feels good, something that sparks curiosity.
Absolutely. So make it a daily thing, even if it's just for a short burst, and choose material that keeps you engaged. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The video actually highlights the importance of reading aloud.
Oh, reading aloud. Now that's intriguing.
I know, right? At first it might seem a bit weird, but they make a really good point. When you read aloud, you're not just seeing the words, you're actually saying them, hearing yourself speak them. And this apparently creates a stronger connection in your brain between the written form of the language and the spoken form.
So it's like you're activating multiple parts of your brain simultaneously. You're processing the visual information, translating that into speech, and then actually hearing yourself produce those sounds. That's got to make a difference.
Exactly. And the video suggests a neat little technique. Read a sentence silently first to get the meaning, then read it aloud. You can even repeat it a couple of times if you want to really get comfortable with the pronunciation. And get this, one of the awesome byproducts of all this reading is that you naturally start absorbing new vocabulary, like without even trying too hard.
I love when that happens. It's like your brain's secretly working in the background, soaking things up.
Right. The video mentions how you start noticing patterns and how words are used, you come across new phrases, and these things just kind of stick in your mind. And before you know it, you're using these new words and phrases in conversations without even thinking about it.
If you think about how our brains work, it totally makes sense. We're wired for pattern recognition. So when you're constantly exposed to language, your brain starts picking up on those recurring patterns, those common phrases, those subtle ways that words fit together. It's like you're training your brain to decode the language almost on autopilot.
Okay, so let's move on to habit number 2, which is listening to English every single day. Now, here's the thing, and the video is really clear about this. It's not just about having English sounds in the background. Like, sure, it's great to have the TV on or listen to music while you're doing other things, but what they're really emphasizing is focused listening.
So it's about really tuning in and actively engaging with what you're hearing.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself, am I really paying attention to what's being said, or is it just kind of background noise? Because there's a big difference, right?
Huge difference. It's like the difference between passively observing something and actively trying to understand it, to break it down, to figure out how it works.
And something the video talks about, which I think a lot of language learners struggle with, is the difference between the kind of textbook English you might learn in a classroom setting and how people actually speak out in the real world, with all the slang and different accents and those little quirks people have when they talk.
Oh, yeah, that could be a real shock to the system. You think you're getting pretty good, then you encounter someone with a thick accent or hear a slang term you've never come across before, and it's like, wait, what?
They even tell this funny story in the video about how they were trying to watch this British sitcom, but the accent was so strong they could barely understand what was going on. And I think a lot of us have been there, right?
Totally. I remember this was years ago. I was watching this Australian movie, and I thought I was pretty good at understanding English, but the slang they were using was so thick, I was completely lost. I had to keep rewinding and looking up words. It's hilarious, but also a bit humbling.
Right. It shows you that real-world English is so much richer and more diverse than what you often find in textbooks or formal language courses.
And that's exactly why it's so important to expose yourself to a variety of accents and speaking styles. It's like training your ear to recognize the subtle differences, to tune into those nuances of how people actually speak.
So their advice is, don't be afraid to start at a level that feels comfortable for you. If listening to native speakers at full speed feels overwhelming, that's totally okay. Use subtitles, slow down the audio, whatever you need to do to make it feel manageable.
It's all about gradually stretching your comfort zone. You don't want to jump into the deep end and feel like you're drowning. It's better to start where you feel confident and gradually increase the challenge as your listening skills improve.
And here's another cool tip they shared, one that I actually use all the time. Don't be afraid to replay content multiple times.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm a big fan of repetition.
Me too. It's like the first time you listen to something, you might only catch maybe 50%, maybe even less.
Yeah.
But then you listen again, and you pick up a few more words, a few more phrases. And by the third or fourth time, you're understanding almost everything. It's like your brain just needs a few rounds to warm up and process all the information.
It makes sense if you think about how our brains create connections. Each time you're exposed to something, those neural pathways get a little stronger, a little more efficient. So repetition is a powerful way to solidify your understanding and make those connections stick.
And just like with reading, consistency is key with listening. Even if it's just 15 minutes a day, make it a habit. Don't try to cram in hours of listening every once in a while. It's those regular short bursts that really add up over time.
I completely agree. It's like you wouldn't expect to get in shape by going to the gym once a month and working out for 5 hours straight. It's those consistent daily workouts that make the real difference. Same goes for language learning.
Okay, let's tackle habit number 3, which is speaking every day. Now, I know this is the one that a lot of English learners dread because you immediately think, well, I need someone to practice with. I need a speaking partner. But guess what? The video actually says you don't necessarily need a partner to get valuable speaking practice.
Oh, tell me more about that. I think a lot of people get stuck on the idea that they need to find someone to talk to.
Right, and it can feel really intimidating, especially if you're not confident in your speaking skills yet. But the video has some great suggestions for how to practice speaking on your own.
I'm all ears.
One of the things they suggest, and I know this might sound a bit silly, is talking to yourself.
I admit I do that sometimes, and my husband just gives me this look like, are you okay? But it helps.
Right. It might feel weird at first, but they make a good point. You're not giving a TED talk here. You're just practicing getting your mouth used to forming the sounds of English. And they say, if you're worried about sounding weird, who cares? No one's watching you.
I love that. It's so true. It takes the pressure off. You can make all the mistakes you want, experiment with different pronunciations, try out new words and phrases, and no one's there to judge you.
Exactly. They also suggest reading aloud, which, as we already talked about, has a bunch of benefits. And another one they recommend is recording yourself speaking.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It can be a little cringy to listen back to yourself at first, but it's a great way to identify areas where you need to improve.
Totally. You might hear things you don't even notice when you're just speaking in the moment, like maybe you're stumbling over certain words, or maybe your intonation is a bit off.
It's like having a little speech coach in your pocket. You can listen back, analyze your mistakes, and then focus on those areas when you practice.
Now, of course, the video does acknowledge that if you have the opportunity to practice speaking with other people, whether it's in a language exchange group, with a tutor, or through an app, that's fantastic. But their point is, don't let the lack of a speaking partner stop you from practicing altogether. There's so much you can do on your own.
It's like any practice is better than no practice. And sometimes solo practice can actually be more beneficial in the early stages because it allows you to build confidence and fluency in a safe environment. Then, when you do get the chance to talk to someone, you'll feel much more comfortable and prepared.
And they have this really great advice about starting small with speaking practice. Don't feel like you have to jump into full-blown conversations right away. Start with simple things like reading your text messages aloud or narrating what you're doing while you're cooking or cleaning. Just get your mouth moving and making those English sounds.
It's all about building those speech muscles, right? The
Yeah.
more you actually speak, the easier it will become. It's like anything else. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel.
All right, habit number 4 is all about immersion. It's about surrounding yourself with English as much as possible, almost like you're creating your own little English-speaking bubble. And the video has some really cool ideas for how to do this.
I'm all for creating language bubbles. It's like transporting yourself to an English-speaking country without even leaving your house.
Exactly. And one of the main things they recommend is making English language entertainment a regular part of your life. So things like watching TV shows and movies in English, listening to English language music, maybe even getting into English language podcasts.
It's like tricking your brain into thinking you're in an English-speaking environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the great thing is, it doesn't even feel like work because you're doing things you already enjoy.
Right. It's not like you're sitting down with a textbook and forcing yourself to study. You're just relaxing and having fun. But at the same time, your brain is absorbing all this language input.
And it's not just about passive listening either. When you're watching a show or a movie, you're also seeing the language in action. You're observing how people use it in different contexts. You're picking up on those subtle nuances of communication.
And they also recommend taking this immersion a step further by changing the language settings on your devices and online accounts.
Oh, that's a good one. I remember when I first started learning English, I switched the language on my phone to English. It was a little confusing at first, but it really helped me get used to seeing those everyday words and phrases.
Right. It's like you're constantly being nudged to think in English, even when you're not actively studying. And they suggest doing the same thing with your social media accounts. Maybe start following some English-speaking creators, change the language settings on the videos you watch online.
It's all about making those little adjustments that, over time, add up to a lot more exposure to the language. It's like you're passively learning without even realizing it.
And here's another clever tip they shared. If you're using subtitles while you're watching movies or shows, try to keep the subtitles in English as well.
Ah, that's interesting. I usually switch to my native language for subtitles so I can really follow along.
Yeah, a lot of people do that, but they make a good point that when you have the English audio and the English subtitles, you're basically getting a double dose of input. You're hearing the language and seeing it written down at the same time, so your brain is making those connections even more strongly.
It's like you're training your brain to recognize those patterns in both the spoken and written forms of the language.
Exactly. And another tip they gave, which I think is really important, is to start with content that's relatively easy to understand. So maybe documentaries or slower paced dramas where the language is a bit clearer and people aren't talking a mile a minute.
Yeah, it's easy to get discouraged if you jump into something too challenging. It's better to start with something you can follow along with fairly easily and then gradually work your way up to more complex content.
Okay, we've reached the final habit, habit number 5, which is writing in English every single day. And just like with speaking, the video reassures us that this doesn't mean you have to suddenly become a novelist or start writing long, complicated essays.
Phew, that's a relief. I'm not sure I'm ready to write a dissertation in English just yet.
Yeah, me neither. What they actually suggest is something much simpler and more approachable: keeping a journal.
Ah, journaling. That's a great idea. I used to keep a journal when I was younger, but I haven't done it in years.
Well, maybe it's time to pick it back up again. They say that even just writing a few sentences each day can be really beneficial. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just write about your day, how you're feeling, maybe what you're planning to do tomorrow.
It's like a little snapshot of your life in English.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be perfect. You can make mistakes, experiment with new words and phrases. Just let your thoughts flow onto the page.
Exactly. And one of the cool things about keeping a journal is that you can go back and look at your older entries and see how much you've progressed.
Oh yeah, that's so motivating. It's like, wow, I used to make that mistake all the time, and now I don't even think about it anymore. Or, look, I've actually started using more complex grammar structures without even realizing it. It's really encouraging to see those little victories.
And they also suggest looking up any words you don't know while you're writing in your journal. It's like That's the perfect opportunity to learn new vocabulary because you're encountering the need for that word in a real personal context.
It makes so much more sense than just memorizing lists of words out of context. When you're actively trying to express yourself in writing, those new words are going to stick in your mind much better.
And you can even use your journal to keep track of any new words or phrases you come across in other places, like in movies or TV shows or in conversations with people. It's like creating your own personal vocabulary notebook.
I love that idea. It's like instead of just letting those new words fly by, you're actively capturing them and making them your own.
So there you have it, the 5 simple habits. Read in English every day, listen to English every day, speak in English every day, immerse yourself in English as much as possible, and write in English every day. But as the video points out, knowing these habits is only half the battle. The real challenge is making them stick.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people get tripped up. It's one thing to think, oh, I should really start doing that, but it's another thing entirely to actually make it a consistent part of your routine.
And that's where their advice about fitting these habits into your existing daily routine comes in. It's not about creating a whole bunch of new activities. It's about finding ways to weave them into the things you're already doing.
Makes sense. I mean, who has time to add a bunch of extra stuff to their schedule? It's much more realistic to find those little pockets of time throughout your day where you can sneak in some English practice.
And they give some really great examples in the video, like maybe you listen to English podcasts while you're cooking dinner or while you're commuting to work.
Or maybe you practice speaking while you're getting ready in the morning, just talking to yourself in the mirror.
And instead of watching TV in your native language, just switch it to English. It's such a simple change, but it can make a big difference over time.
And maybe right before you go to bed, spend 5 minutes jotting down a few thoughts in your English journal. It's like a little brain dump before you drift off to sleep.
Exactly. The point is, there are so many little ways to fit these habits into your day without having to make huge changes to your lifestyle.
And the video makes a really interesting point that once you manage to establish a consistent rhythm with these habits, they eventually stop feeling like a chore.
Yeah, it's like at first you have to consciously remind yourself to do them, but after a while they just become automatic, like brushing your teeth or making your morning coffee.
It's all about creating those positive feedback loops. The more you do something, the easier it becomes and the more rewarding it feels. So it's this upward spiral of progress.
And the video encourages listeners to experiment and find what works best for them. Maybe some habits are easier to stick with than others, and that's totally fine. The important thing is to keep trying different things until you find a routine that fits your lifestyle and that you can actually stick with.
It's all about personalization. What works for one person might not work for another. The key is to find those strategies that you enjoy and that you can realistically maintain over the long term.
So the takeaway message from this deep dive is, if you want to improve your English fluency, focus on building those simple daily habits. It's not about quick fixes or intense study sessions. It's about those consistent small efforts that add up to big results over time.
And the best part is, these habits are accessible to anyone, regardless of their current level of English. It's never too early or too late to start incorporating them into your life.
Now, here's something to ponder as we wrap up. Take a look at your daily schedule for tomorrow. Where is one small window of time or one existing activity where you could realistically fit in just one of these English learning habits? Even just 5 or 10 minutes can make a difference. Maybe you listen to a short English news podcast on your way to work, or maybe you read one paragraph of an English book before you go to bed. Experiment with it this week and see what kind of impact it has on your English skills. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.